Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's really lovely to have you all here for our CAQDAS webinar series. We've got a great presentation coming up today. My name is Sarah Bullock, and I work at the CAQDAS Networking Project at the University of Surrey in Guildford. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Christina Silva, who manages the CAQDAS Networking Project as well. And we're delighted to have you all with us today. Just a few things before we get started with our main talk for this session. We just wanted to highlight some training that's coming up at the CAQDAS Networking Project over the next month or so. So if you'd like a little bit more information about that, please do visit our website, and we will pop into the chat in a moment the links to our website. Additionally, if you are yourself interested in presenting at one of these webinars, we're always looking for contributors. Please do get in touch with us to have a chat about what you think you might like to present, and we can go from there. It'd be lovely to hear from you. Additionally, we are delighted to be partnering with the Social Research Association on a free two-part symposium on artificial intelligence and qualitative data analysis. And that's going to take place on the 24th of November and the 1st of December, 2 half days. So please do look up that event if you're interested. Okay, let's think about today then. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Professor David Williamson Shaffer. Professor Shaffer, who's waving there, hello, is the Sears Bascom Professor of Learning Analytics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Department of Education and Psychology. He's also a data philosopher at the Wisconsin Center for Education Research. He has authored more than 250 publications with over 100 co-authors, including the books How Computer Games Help Children Learn and Quantitative Ethnography. It's about this later work that we're going to hear a little bit more today. His talk, Quantitative Ethnography, Human Science in the Age of Big Data, is going to talk to us about the transformation of the social sciences in the age of big data and how we might go beyond the old dichotomy of quantitative and qualitative methods, and also past simple mixtures of methods in data analysis. We're going to hear a bit from Professor Williamson Shaffer's approach to merging statistical and qualitative methods to conduct fair models of complex and collaborative human activity. And I really look forward to this talk. Whilst David is speaking, can I ask you all to post your comments and your questions in the chat function, and then I will collate those and they will be put to our speaker today at the end of the session. So hopefully that's all okay. We're also recording this webinar, so you will be able to access that after today. All right, so without any further ado, I will hand over to you, David. Thank you.
Super. Thanks so much, Sarah. Let me just steal the screen from you.
Perfect.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here today and have a chance to speak to all of you. Thanks for coming. I know everybody has lots of things they can do on a Monday morning or afternoon or evening, I suppose, depending on where you are. I'm going to talk a little bit today about quantitative ethnography, which I see as a human science for the age of big data. And let me unpack that a little bit. So first, let's talk about the science part of human science. So in science, any kind of empirical work, we're always trying to do the same thing, which is to go from some kind of activity in the world to some claim about that activity. And we pretty much always use the same process to do it. That is, we observe the activity, we organize those observations systematically into data of some kind, we encode that data, whether it's into variables or qualitative codes, we make some kind of model of those codes, and then we make some claim based on the model. So far, I've told you absolutely nothing that you don't already know. But my point is that at each step of this process, we lose information. Activity in the world is incredibly rich. There's sights, there's sounds, there's taste, there's touch, there's a blooming, buzzing confusion that William James talked about. Of all of that activity, we're only able to record some small portion of it. We take that recording, those observations and data, and we encode them in some way. And then we take those codes and we make a model. And that could be a qualitative model or a process model or a cultural model or a quantitative model. But in each of these cases, the model has way less information than the original activity. And we can think of information as being signal, that is the part that we think is important, that we care about, and the noise, the part that we don't care about so much. And we can compute a ratio of those two. So the signal to noise ratio. And if we're able to reduce the amount of noise, the signal to noise ratio goes up, and so the signal becomes clearer. Similarly, in our pathway here, if we remove noise at each step, then we lose information, but the information that counts becomes easier to see. And this is good, and in fact, part of how science works, or actually all of how science works. Of course, the question is, how do we make sure that when we're doing this, right, we are removing the noise and not removing the signal? Well, there's a couple of ways to do this. So one of them is something called closing the interpretive loop. That is, we need to be able to go back from the claim to the model to investigate whether the model, in fact, makes sense given the claim that we're making from it, and to go back from the model to the codes and make sure that given the model and the claim, the codes are the right codes, that they're valid enough, and so forth. Then we need to go back from the codes to the data. In order to do that, we'd like, obviously, to go back to the activity, but that's impossible. And as I say, in quantitative ethnography, we call this closing the interpretive loop. And this is a basic matter of fairness. And by this, I mean fairness in terms of the more common use of equity, but also in the more technical sense of what Nelson Goodman called a fair sample. In explaining what a fair sample meant, Goodman suggested this analogy. If I'm going to sell you a bolt of cloth that's so big that you can't see the whole thing, I have to show you some small piece of it as a sample, as a representative of the whole. Now, I hope we can all reasonably agree that this is probably the best representative of the picture that I just showed you a moment ago of the whole cloth. Goodman argues that a fair sample is one that may be rightly projected to the pattern or mixture or other relevant features of the whole or of further samples. And of course, the key term here is projected to, because when we're making this projection, we have to make sure that we're thinking about that fair sample as being fair to something, fair to a theory. That is, we want to make sure that the way that we've done our study represents the theory in a way that people who are advocates for the theory believe was accurate, is fair to the data, that is, it accurately represents the data, that it fairly represents the community that generated the data, and that it's fair to subgroups within that community. In order to do that, we have to make sure that our processes are transparent, they're accurate, they're interpretable, and not just interpretable, but piecewise interpretable, meaning we should be able to explain all the choices that we made along the way. And that it has to be transparent, accurate, and interpretable, not only for the group as a whole or the data as a whole, but for subgroups within the data. In order to do that, we need a second thing, though. We need theory. And here's the thing about theory. Theory is sort of ineffable a little bit. It kind of floats at a very high level. In order to actually use theory, we have to take that theory and ground it. And that brings me to the human part of human science. And where quantitative ethnography starts, and I think much of qualitative analysis starts, is the idea that human activity always takes place within some cultural context. And of course, culture just means that the same events can mean different things to different people in different contexts. Let me just give you a quick example. So I grew up in New York City. And as a city kid, when I saw a patch of dirt on the ground, the only thing I was really worried about was whether or not it would make my shoes muddy. Was the dirt so wet that it was going to stick to my shoes? And this is because, as I say, I grew up in New York City. I was a city kid, and that's the way city kids think about dirt. Jim G describes this in terms of what he calls a big D discourse, which is just a way of using language, of thinking, feeling, believing, valuing, and acting that's part of some group. So, for example, if instead of being a city kid, I was an archaeologist, I would look at the dirt very differently. I might look at the dirt to see whether there was evidence of things that happened in the past, in the distant past, things like post holes. So a post hole is just a place where somebody has dug a hole in the ground, put usually a piece of wood in it and filled it back in, and then use that post to build a fence of some kind. And this is useful because it gives archaeologists an understanding about what people might have been doing at that point in time. You don't put up a fence unless you're planning to stay for a while. Fences are usually signs of agriculture or more advanced cultures that are trying to defend themselves from enemies, and so on. The thing about a post hole is when that wood rots away, it leaves a patch of ground that looks a little different than the dirt around it. Why? Well, because the wood is made of a different material than the surrounding soil, and when it rots away, it's a different color. This is, of course, why archaeologists use something called a Munsell color chart to very carefully measure and grade the color of dirt as they move around a site. Now, my point here is that dirt and Munsell color charts and post holes are all big C codes in the big D discourse of archaeology. And a big C code is just a culturally relevant and meaningful part of a big D discourse. If you don't believe me, by the way, that post holes are an important part of the discourse of archaeology, I submit that one of their journals is called The Post Hole. Now, of course, these codes don't just exist in isolation. They're systematically related to one another. So, for example, you use a Munsell color chart in order to analyze the color of soil so that you can identify where post holes might be. So, to recap here, people understand their world in terms of culture. That culture is constructed of a particular discourse, a way of using language, feeling, believing, and acting. That discourse is composed of codes, which are just the culturally relevant and meaningful aspects of a discourse. They're the things people pay attention to. And we understand a culture by understanding the relationship between those codes. Let me give you a quick example of that. So I'm going to show just a tiny bit of data from an educational simulation called Rescue Shell. You only need to know two things about this, really. One is that these students are working as engineers to design a robotic exoskeleton, so something that a rescue worker straps on to help them carry heavier loads or walk longer distances. And you need to know that this simulation was done in a jigsaw. I'm sure we've all done a jigsaw activity at least one more time than we wanted to in our educational career. But the idea of a jigsaw is that the students are broken up into teams. Those teams each learn about one part of the design challenge. And then those original teams, people are regrouped into new teams, and the new teams now have all the pieces that they need to solve the problem, but now they have to work together to come up with their proposed solution. And what we're going to look at is data from just one of these teams right after that jigsaw. So here we see, this is the students' chats, by the way. They're talking to each other in a chat box as part of the simulation. So their mentor, Justin Kim, says, please take a moment to introduce yourselves and indicate what actuator you have experience with. In other words, he's invoking the start of their collaboration. The students respond by saying hello, introducing themselves, talking about which group they worked with in the previous part of the simulation. And the conversation takes a turn when Daniel says, so how did your designs perform? It's nice that that's the group you worked with, but what did you actually see when you did your original design work? The students respond by talking about technical requirements. The safety was close to the company requirement. We were able to reach all internal consultants' requests. Gabby says, we used pneumatic and it seemed to meet everyone's required and most preferred. To which Michael says, well, okay, but what were the results of those? He makes a call for the actual data about what of the designs that students produced in the first part of the simulation. And the students respond by, well, talking about data. They talk about what the payload is. The agility was 203. They talk about the cost, $14,540, and so on. Those numbers don't mean much to me, obviously, but they meant something to the students. And our conversation takes a final turn here when, based on this data, Elizabeth says, I think we need to determine which attributes are the most important to us so we can meet those requirements, and then just simpler ones for the ones that are less important. In other words, she starts talking about design trade-offs. And for anyone who knows something about engineering design, this is sort of the whole ball game, right? In engineering design, you're always trying. You can never get a perfect design, so you're always trying to to figure out which of the things are most important so you can focus on those without making the other aspects of the design so problematic that the design doesn't work. Okay, and scene. Right, so I've just told you a little story. This is about a group of students who needed to get to design trade-offs by talking about data. But before that, they had to talk about collaboration and technical requirements. And actually, for the rest of their design process, they more or less go through this loop talking about data, design trade-offs, technical requirements, and so on. Now, the story I just told you is fundamentally qualitative. There was qualitative observations, qualitative data, qualitative encoding. I showed you a little qualitative model at the end. And this qualitative analysis gets us something important. It gets us interpretability. That is, we have a sense that we understand what it was those students were doing. This isn't just a set of codes and a model that I splashed up. We actually saw some of what the students were saying, and by extension, some of what they were doing in their design process. Now, of course, I didn't do something important in qualitative analysis. That is, I didn't reach the point of theoretical saturation. If I had done this analysis well, right, I would have looked at more examples. And of course, theoretical saturation is just the process of looking at the data and continuing to look at the data and continuing to see things in the data until eventually we reach the point where we're not really seeing anything new. And that's the point where we've achieved what Nelson Goodman describes as a fair sample. In other words, qualitative analyses get us meaning. We have a sense that we understand what these things meant to these people. We could also think about this in a quantitative framework. The most typical way that people do that, at least in my field, the learning sciences, is with coding and counting. So this is sort of what it sounds like. We take the codes and we count them, and then we do some kind of comparison for perhaps in this case that novices talked about data more than experts, which is actually probably not true. Now, one thing though, is this is sort of a strange theory of discourse, because it says that this data is exactly equivalent to this data if all I'm doing is counting the codes, which is exactly equivalent to this data, which, well, it's kind of a weird theory of discourse because we generally assume that people make meaning in the interactions that have some kind of order to them. In response to this, some people use some class of models called Markov or state transition models. Here we take the codes again, but now we look at the transitions. So technical requirements leads to technical requirements, and again, technical requirements leads to technical requirements. That's two transitions from technical requirements to technical requirements. And then we basically mark that as part of the network of transitions, and then we compute the transition probabilities. That is the likelihood that once I'm at technical requirements, I'm going to go to anything else. And we do that across all of the codes in the data. Now, there are a couple of problems with this approach. One of them is you'll notice there wasn't anything immediately preceding data. So this would get a transition for data of, well, 0. That is, it wouldn't count in the model. But we know that when Michael was asking for the results of the best prototype, he was responding to this previous conversation about technical requirements. There's another problem, which is that, well, these networks are kind of hard to read. For example, can you spot the difference between these? I'll give you just a moment. Well, the answer is probably no. And it's not your fault. It's that these are actually the same network, right? They have the same connection of 0.2 between from technical requirements to design trade-offs, the same connection from design trade-offs to data of 0.4, and the same connection of data to technical requirements of 0.7. All I did was move the nodes around. And the problem is that in this kind of layout, the position of the nodes is non-deterministic. The information in the arrows is encoded in ways that are hard to read. And as a result, it's hard to visually interpret these diagrams. Another approach that is called sequential pattern mining. Here we look not just at one transition, but at a whole sequence of transitions. So technical requirements to technical requirements to technical requirements to data. Of course, the problem here is that from a sequential pattern mining point of view, this is fundamentally different than that, which is fundamentally different than that, which is fundamentally different than all these other ways of talking about technical requirements, collaboration, and data before somebody else talks about data. Put another way, if we have sequences up to length 4 and 4 codes, we get 340 variables. And, well, that's kind of a lot of variables. As anybody who does quantitative methods knows, right? If I have enough variables, I can eventually explain something, but my model becomes either quickly overfit or impossible to read. And that's what happens here. So people typically use something like a dimensional reduction, some kind of technique to take all those variables and reduce their complexity. For those of you who know about principal components, right? We find the linear combination of things that load strongly together on one component, and then the things that load negatively. And then, well, we kind of squint at the data and go, oh, there seems to be a lot of collaboration on principal component 1. And if that's all we're going to do, why not just code and count in the first place? There's another class of models people use, some called supervised machine learning or neural networks. Here we take the codes and we give them to the network, and the network makes some kind of prediction. And we can't really explain how it got there or why. Of course, now people talk about using AI. Here we can give the uncoded data and ask the machine to tell us how well these students did. It can even provide an explanation. Right? So Gabrielle opted for the pneumatic system, which met the majority's requirements, showcasing effective decision-making skills as an engineer. Well, she did talk about pneumatic, but it's not really clear that this is showcasing effective decision-making skills. And more to the point, it's not really clear why that would be a 9 as opposed to an 8 or a 7 or a 6. In other words, with AI, we get, well, not quite a black box. We get a gray box because AI is not deterministic. That is, if we ask the same question, we might get different answers under different circumstances. Quantitative ethnography takes a different approach from all of these methods. Of course, we look at the data and we look at the codes on the data. But now what we're going to do is we're going to look at each line of data and look at the things that immediately preceded it that impacted that line. That is, we look at the common ground. And the common ground is just the things that Lena was responding to when she talked about electric and, depending on other aspects, also meant required and most preferred. Funny thing about common ground is that of course, we assume when we speak that somebody remembers something that we just said, that's the last thing that was said, because otherwise it's very difficult to have a conversation. And of course, we expect that somebody remembers not just the last thing that was said, but things several turns back in the conversation. But that length of time, that length of the common ground doesn't actually depend on how far back the speaker remembers, because how far back I remember is not necessarily the same as how far back you remember. And it doesn't depend on how far back you remember, because I don't know how far back you remember. What it depends on is how far back the speaker assumes that everybody else remembers. In other words, even as we're doing it, the common ground is an estimate. It's an estimate of how far people remember back in the conversation. Because, of course, if somebody says something that's outside of this common ground window, they tend to reintroduce it. They refer back to it explicitly because they assume that people don't remember. So now we're going to take this little common ground window and we're just going to slide it through the data, looking at each line of data. And when we see a place where something in the current utterance, in the current thing that's happening, connects back to something, another code in the common ground, I'm just going to mark a point in the network or connection in the network. When we go to the next line of data, it might make different connections. Another line might make multiple connections. And if we go back and add up all the connections in these lines of data across, say, everybody in a group or an individual working in a group, we get a network. This is just called epistemic network analysis. It's only one of the techniques that people use in quantitative ethnography, but it's probably the most common. I'd just like to show you a short video. Hopefully the video and the sound will come through. But this video is looking at a scene from Law and Order, the American television show. It's a police procedural, so the people are talking about a murder case in this case. And what you'll see in the video is across the top a transcript. So that way, if the audio doesn't work, you'll at least be able to follow along. That transcript, of course, represents the data that we would ordinarily collect. And then what you'll see as the conversation goes on, that is, as the activity goes on, you'll see the construction of the epistemic network for each person. Just as a trigger warning, this video is about the murder of an infant. So if that's something that's going to trouble you, please feel free to ignore the video, just turn off your sound. All the rest of the talk will still make sense without watching the video.
Her affect was flat, almost dissociative.
You think she's setting the stage for a psych defense?
Well, it'll be hard going if she is.
Because she's faking it.
No, because DSM-4 diagnostic standards still don't exist for postpartum psychiatric illnesses.
Here we go.
Many courts bar its admission. That's the reason why infanticide sentences vary so wildly in this country. Some women are given the death penalty, and others are given probation.
You think postpartum depression should excuse murdering your child?
It's not depression. I think she's suffering from postpartum psychosis.
Giving birth made her crazy.
It's a hormonal imbalance stemming from pregnancy. Its onset can be quick and severe. Its symptoms include agitation, hallucinations, delusions.
The Andrea Yates defense.
Look, the only thing making this girl crazy is the baby's father. I don't know what part he played, but I know that he's involved.
Liv.
So as we're watching this video, we get a really clear sense that these three people have a different view of what's going on in this murder investigation. Now we get a mathematical representation that shows the different ways in which they're linking together the key ideas in the case. For those of you who watch Law and Order, you know that, of course, Olivia is always right. It was, in fact, the baby's father. So having shown you this example, let's look at, well, the group that we just looked at and look at their epistemic network. Here it is. This is the network for the group. Here's Michael's network. Michael, you may recall, is the person who asked about the results, asked about data in response to technical requirements. And here's that connection. He actually did it more than once. That's why the line is thick. Here's Elizabeth's network. As you may recall, Elizabeth has this strong connection between design trade-offs and data. And as you recall, Elizabeth is the person who, in response to data, talked about design trade-offs. Now, at this point, I hope some of you are thinking, wait a minute, you just threw up these networks and threw up these points. Like, how did all the math of this work? Well, briefly, it's a dimensional reduction and then a regression. And I'm not actually going to explain much of that here, and I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. The thing we need to know here is that each person or group has a network. Each network is also associated with a data point in the model. And those two are related in the sense that if the connections in the network are strong on, say, the right-hand side, then the point is going to be further over on the right-hand side. If the connections are strong on the left-hand side, then the point is going to be further over on the left-hand side. So, for example, Michael's point is up and to the right because he made connections that are up and to the right. Elizabeth's point is lower down, but still to the right because she made connections that were lower down, but still to the right. And this means that we can look at a point and, without having looked at its network, have some understanding of what that network probably looks like. So Zachary's point is low and to the right, and sure enough, his connections are lower and to the right. What this means is that we don't just have to look at the networks of a few people or a few groups and compare them looking at the side by side. We can look at a whole group of networks, say a group of networks from more advanced students in this engineering simulation. We can find their mean in this epistemic network space. We can look at their mean network. And of course, in this case, their points are all on the right, so their networks are heavier on the right. We can look at a different group, say a group of novice students. We can look at their mean point in the space. We can look at their mean network. We can compare the points in the space. We can compare them statistically. We can see that these networks are statistically significantly different. We can use their networks to understand why these groups are different. So for example, in this case, the novices focused more on collaboration relative to the experts or the advanced students, and the advanced students focused more on talking about data. And this actually makes sense. If I took a bunch of you and randomly put you together in an engineering simulation, well, the first thing you'd have to figure out is like, who's supposed to do what? If you've done this kind of thing before, then you can more quickly move to talking about data, which of course, as we saw, is one of the sort of key linchpins in being able to do engineering design. We can, of course, add addition or remove codes from the model. We can do things like organize the codes so they're a little bit easier to read. Say if we were sharing this with the students or with the teacher as a way of understanding how well the students were performing. I mentioned the choosing the window size, that is the size of the common ground. In this case, the common ground was 7, which we determined by a qualitative analysis of the data. And I can say more about that in the questions if people like. Notice that if I change it to say 6, well, the model doesn't change very much. And there's some mathematical reasons for that we can talk about in the questions if you'd like. Notice, though, that this diagram is basically the diagram I saw you when I saw you, early in the morning, I guess. This diagram is basically the same diagram that I showed you when I showed you qualitative data. And this makes sense because this was a group of more advanced students. Of course, we don't just want to present the model and say, we're done. We also want to be able to go back from the model and look at the data itself in light of the model. So, for example, if we look at Elizabeth's connection between design trade-offs and data and we sort of click it, we can actually see where those connections took place in the data. So here's the connection that I showed you originally. Notice that in this case, somebody else is talking about data and Elizabeth is responding by talking about design trade-offs. We can look elsewhere and see the other connections that she made between design trade-offs and data. In this case, somebody else was talking about design trade-offs and she's responding by talking about data. We see the same thing in another clip. Notice, by the way, those orange brackets represent the common ground or the window. In other places, she made the connection the same way. So we might ask, well, Elizabeth made strong connections between design trade-offs and data, but does it matter whether she was the one responding with data or responding with design trade-offs? We can actually change the model so that it's, instead of just looking at whether two things were related to one another, the direction of that relationship. So, for example, this model, called an ordered network analysis, shows that when other people were talking about technical requirements, Elizabeth responded by talking a lot about data. Here we see that indeed, when people were talking about data, she responded with design trade-offs, just as we saw in our qualitative example. But she actually responded with data more. Now, is this important? Does this change our story? Well, I don't know. We'd have to look back at the data. And one of the things that this technique allows us to do is, as I say, close the interpretive loop. That is to go back to the data and the codes and the model and see whether or not everything lines up and iterate until we get to a place where our story and our model and our claim all align. Notice that here, this model is slightly different. So the codes are in a different location in the space, although not dramatically different. The big thing is that some of the codes have moved down, and of course, therefore, some of the data points have moved down. More important, though, well, when I show you a data point in this model, it represents a huge compression of information. Right? Each of these data points represents a half a semester of students, of undergraduate engineering students working in an engineering simulation. And we've crunched that down to 2 numbers, an X coordinate and a Y coordinate. The only way to reduce that data further would be just to use the X coordinate. But here's the thing. We've done this in such a way that if I pick a data point, I can actually zoom in and see what kinds of connections put that data point where it is. And I can zoom in and see in the data what about the data led to those connections, which led to the point being where it is. In other words, this is a technique that lets us close the interpretive loop. We started out from our qualitative data by getting meaning, by having interpretability and theoretical saturation. Now, with our quantitative approach, we can find patterns. We can find patterns in the data that correspond to our original interpretation, and we can see whether those patterns repeat in a statistically significant way. In other words, we get formal testability. Now notice, I haven't just taken a qualitative model and a quantitative model and triangulated. That is to see whether or not the two different models sort of point to something that's similar. This isn't a mixed method. If you remember your basic chemistry, right, a mixture is something like chicken soup. Right? If I make chicken soup, I take soup and matzo balls and chicken, and I put them together, and it's delicious. But I can take the matzo balls out, I can take the chicken out, I can take the soup out, and the matzo ball is still a matzo ball, the chicken's still chicken, the soup is still soup. This is compared to, say, making lemonade, where I take lemon juice and sugar and water, and I put them all together, and I stir them up, and I get what in chemical terms is called a solution. And a solution means that the elements have combined in a way that they are now no longer the same elements that they were. I can't take them back out and have them be unchanged. And what's happening here in this epistemic network analysis is that we're looking at the same data, the same model, and the same claim in two different ways. In other words, we get a statistical warrant for theoretical saturation. We get what Geertz refers to as internal generalization. We're generalizing within the data. And this is useful because when we have formal testability and meaning, we can get fairness, right? Qualitative analysis gives us meaning. It gives us the ability to see whether or not our model is accurate. If we have no qualitative understanding of the data, what does it mean for it to be accurate? And it's interpretable, right? We get our interpretation from the meaning. The formal testability makes it possible to show that our model is transparent. We can show what we've done, how it repeats in the data, and somebody else can look at that or even rerun that same analysis. And we can test all of these things now in a systematic way with the different subgroups in the data to see whether or not all of these properties still hold. And this is the basic idea of quantitative ethnography. That is to integrate qualitative and quantitative methods in these ways by looking at the same data, the same model, and the same codes. So this brings us to the sort of part of the talk that I like to call, but what if my data? So sometimes people might say, well, but what if my data isn't chat messages from university students in an engineering simulation? Well, hopefully it's clear that this is just an example. This technique can be used across a wide varieties of data that's generated by human activity. What if my data is threaded? So I'm looking at Reddit, for example, or Twitter, the platform formerly known as Twitter. Well, that's actually not a problem. We just construct the common ground a little differently. We construct it in terms of threads instead of in terms of temporal sequence. What if my data has more than one modality? What if instead of looking like this, my data looks like this? Well, this actually isn't necessarily a problem. We just have to recognize that each of these modes has a different way in which past events influence events in the future. So, for example, chats might be more persistent in the common ground than gestures, which might be less persistent than somebody's stress level, and so on. And this just means that we have to look, when we look back, we have to use these different windows for different types of data to figure out at any point in time, what is somebody responding to? This is, by the way, called transmodal analysis. And if you want to know more about it, Ye Wang is a graduate student who's working on this. And of course, feel free to write either of us. What if my data isn't text data? Well, as it should be clear, right, that this data could be eye gaze or mouse click or heart rate or gesture or anything else you can think of, because the model cares about the codes, not about the data. It can link the codes back to the data, but it doesn't matter what the data was in the first place. So similarly, what if my data isn't in English? Well, basically the same answer, right? The process works exactly the same way, no matter what the kind of data you're using. What if my data isn't the kind you can code with ones and zeros? Well, mathematically, that's not a problem. That is, we can use some kind of probabilistic coding. Something is 50%. Helena's talking 50% about technical requirements, and Michael's talking 20% about data. The matrix multiplications that are involved actually work the same. We can multiply those two things together, and instead of getting a 1, we get, in this case, a 0.1. Of course, the challenge there is if I look back at what Lena and Michael were saying, is it clear that that's 0.1? Should it have been 0.11? Should it have been 0.15? The problem with using these kinds of partial codes is it makes it extremely difficult to interpret whether what the model produces is actually aligned with the original data. It might be possible that this kind of model can get us, can explain more of the variance in the data, but we do so at the cost of making it more difficult to close the interpretive loop. In other words, there's a trade-off between interpretability and optimization. And what we found in our work is that the interpretability is always going to be more important than the few bits of variance that you can squeeze out by making your model more complex. What if my data is coded using sentiment analysis? Well, so first of all, please don't code your data using sentiment analysis. Sentiment analysis and other things that are similar are trained on huge amounts of data to construct the model, but your data is not necessarily the same as it doesn't necessarily have the same properties as the data on which the model was originally changed. So if you just use this without thinking about it, there's a real challenge to the accuracy. You actually have to go back and make sure that the results from these larger models actually are accurate with your data. And if you're going to bother to validate something like sentiment analysis on your data, why not just come up with the codes yourself? Well, what if my data isn't coded yet? This is, of course, a huge bugaboo and something that people in qualitative data and especially quantitative methods applied to qualitative data think about a lot. You have some options here, right? One of them is hand coding. You produce a code, you produce a definition, you find some examples, and then you code the data. Of course, in order to do that, you have to validate the data, validate the coding. So we get one rater to code the data and another rater to code the data, and then we compare and see where there's the same and where they're different. And we get some kind of overall score, a kappa score or an F score. There's lots of them that you can use. So this process basically goes, somebody codes the data, another person codes the data, you compute the reliability. If the reliability isn't good, you talk and resolve the differences, and then you go back around the process. Rinse and repeat, until you're done. And the problem, of course, is that this tends to be exhausting. There are software packages, NVivo, Deduce, MaxQDA, there's a whole bunch of them, that can help with this process. But the problem is, as long as a human is coding by hand, these things don't scale very well. So if hand coding is getting two people to agree, then we can use something like machine learning and natural language processing to get agreement between a person and the computer. And of course, ideally between two people in the computer, because one person in the computer doesn't guarantee that the code is conceptually valid. Here we take coded data, we give it to the machine to figure out what properties in the data indicate the code. Of course, the problem here is that we have to actually give it a lot of coded data, so it doesn't really solve this problem. Moreover, when we use natural language and machine learning and natural language processing, the classifiers are often really difficult to interpret. It's the same problem we were discussing above about black boxes, and the inter-rater reliability tends to be low. To solve the problem of having to code a lot of data, people sometimes turn to topic modeling, where instead of giving the machine coded data, we give it the raw data, and it tries to figure out what collections of words would probabilistically generate the data. So this does have some advantages. We get classifiers that are at least reasonably interpretable. But the problem is the interpretability is not really clear what we're interpreting, because these are just collections of words. There is no definition that we gave that produced those classifiers. And as a result, there really isn't any inter-rater reliability. So machine learning and natural language processing, topic modeling, if machine learning and natural language processing is getting agreement with the machine, topic modeling is just taking the machine's word for it. Obviously, these days, ChatGPT is the latest and greatest approach to solving problems like this. These large language models are good in the sense that they can give you a reason why they've classified something, but it's very difficult to get inter-rater reliability for the same reasons that we discussed above. And it's also not entirely clear that their reasons are the actual reasons why they produce the code. In my lab, we're working on something called Cody, which is an automated coding tool that helps you find codes in the data, code in ways that are efficient to validate those codes, and then use artificial intelligence and some natural language processing to try and figure out when you're actually ready to validate and to make that validation efficient. What if my data doesn't have conversations? Like, what if my data is interview data, not a bunch of kids working together on an engineering design problem? All right, well, just first of all, let's just acknowledge that an interview actually is a conversation. But even if we aren't looking at something that's a conversation, even if we're looking at something like somebody's diary, so here's a Civil War diary. We see Captain Menard and I rode out in the afternoon to within sight of Mechanicsburg, where we saw the Yankee pickets and a Yankee flag. We heard heavy cannonading and volley after volley of musketry out toward Hanover Courthouse. Well, so here we heard heavy cannonading, we know refers back to Captain Maynard and I. The author goes on to say, I met General Lee going out with some of his staff, trying to learn what was the amount of the fight. And then later, Captain Maynard and I rode down to Drewny's Bluff. But notice here we say Captain Maynard and I. Why? Because in contrast to the example above, this is now far enough away in the text that the author knows that they have to reintroduce it. In other words, even when we're just writing for ourselves, we always have this notion of the common ground and the things that somebody remembers when they're reading or hearing the thing that we're saying currently. But what if my data doesn't have connection between codes? Yeah, okay, well then you shouldn't use techniques like this, because ENA and quantitative ethnography are thinking about the way in which codes are related to one another because they're trying to align with a qualitative view of the world. So I'm going to stop there to make sure we leave time for questions. I'm obliged to thank the National Science Foundation, who funds the work that we've done. I have some great colleagues at UW-Madison, including Ye Wang there on the lower left, who's working on transmodal analysis. There's lots of ways to get more information about quantitative ethnography. There's the book that we mentioned at the beginning. There's an International Society for Quantitative Ethnography that hosts online events, webinars, data challenges. There's an international conference on quantitative ethnography. The next one actually will be in late October, I think, in Philadelphia. And there's a big QE community, and people are very welcoming and interested in helping newcomers. So if you reach out to somebody, they will almost certainly be happy to talk. And let me thank all of you for coming today. And I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to stop sharing my slides so I can see you all. And I'm happy to take questions or have a discussion about anything you'd like. Well, thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was, I have to admit, my very first introduction to the approach as well. And the way that you broke the different steps down was really accessible. So thank you so much. I'm sure that a few people who've joined us today have been foraying into the technique, but it may also be new to others. So thanks for breaking it down so accessibly for us. I did have a couple of questions from my side of things. I spend a lot of my time whilst I do quantitative analysis, and I do what you had termed the kind of mixing of methods, and I do qualitative data analysis. In the qualitative space, I spend quite a lot of time using tools that you mentioned at the end there, like the DEUCE, MaxQDA, Atlas TI, NVivo, etc. And one of the issues that we come across in that space, but what your talk also sparked for me, is the idea of a unit of coding or a unit of meaning. And we often have conversations with students around whether in their particular methods approach, they are working with units of data, or whether they're working with units of meaning. And I was wondering whether you might want to reflect on that just a little, because the data that you showed was quite, the turn taking was quite short, as it were. So it was interesting just to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So the question that you're raising is the technical term for it is, of course, segmentation. Mm-hmm. Segmentation just means cutting something up into meaningful parts.
Yeah.
And of course, they do. The key is that the parts have to be meaningful. So you often see people. Well, let me take a step back. So in order to do anything quantitative, you have to be able to at some level count things, whether you're mm-hmm. counting connections or codes or transitions or whatever it is that you're counting. And in order for those counts to be meaningful, you have to be counting the same kind of thing, right?
Exactly.
So this is what leads people to do things like, coding the data at 1 minute intervals, or at 2 second intervals, or at 10, whatever time interval you want to talk about.
Yeah.
And as Jim G said to me once, you cut a chicken at the joints, right? You don't get something that's very sensible if you just slice things into arbitrary chunks. What you said is, as you said nicely, units of data rather than units of meaning. So absolutely, you should be slicing in terms of units of meaning. In the case, as you point out, of this sort of short turn taking, it's relatively easy to just take an utterance as a turn of talk and go from there.
Yeah.
People handle larger chunks of data in different ways. The easiest is usually just to break things down into sentences if you're talking about human writing or talk. That's because, of course, the purpose of a sentence is that it expresses one complete thought. So it is, in a sense, a natural meaning unit of language. People use paragraphs sometimes. You can, of course, code a very large, a long answer in an interview, for example, or a page of text in a book or something like that with as one meaning unit. The issue is just, it's like a microscope, right?
Yeah.
If you zoom in closer, you see detail that you don't see when you pull out further. On the other hand, there are reasons to pull back further as well in some circumstances. So as with everything in qualitative analysis, the answer is it depends as to what to do with these larger blocks of data. But yes, ultimately, you need to break them into some kind of meaningful units to code.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that reflection. It also highlights our role as researchers when we're preparing data, I suppose, because we also often have conversations with people about the fact that a sentence or a paragraph are structures that we impose on our data when we transcribe them, if they were generated by a discussion. And it's a really helpful reflection that you provide there, that where you put the full stop depends on whether it's a kind of coherent idea within the first full stop and the second. That's a nice guiding way of thinking about it. Paragraphs can sometimes be more tricky. You can see lots of experiments I've done how people transcribe. Some people transcribe really widely in paragraphs, and others put a paragraph break all over the place. So that's an interesting thing to think about, how we also affect the actual format of the data before they meet models like you're discussing.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the right. The point is that from the activity, everything that we do is the researcher expressing some kind of theory about what counts and what doesn't. We always have theory, and that's actually a good thing. Unfortunately, sometimes people say that they're doing something just from the ground up, and there is no way to do something just from the ground up. We always have some theory of the case, whether or not we are explicit about it, right? So we have some theory about what matters in data when we collect a transcript. We have some theory about what matters in data when we transcribe it in different ways. We have some theory when we segment it. We have some theory when we come up with our codes, right? There's always some thing that we're doing to determine what counts as signal and what counts as noise in the data. And that's not a bad thing. We just need to be explicit about it. And I think too often people just let the tools dictate what the choice should be. And the tools, of course, have some theory embedded in them. It's just not necessarily the right theory for your data.
Yeah, it appeals to me greatly, because having worked with quantitative data analysis, where it's often presented as so black and white and cut and dry and objective, I actually believe that there's quite a lot of interpretation going on, even when we're working with numbers that seem objective. There's things that are going on behind that.
Yeah,
not that we're making decisions.
Absolutely. Not to mention all the things that happen to get the numbers in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, I completely agree. For those of us who aren't aware of the technique, what software were you using there, David, to do your analysis?
Sure. So so all the things that we've built, and pretty much everything that operates in the QE community is available in R for those of you who speak R. The ENA, what I was showing is actually a web implementation of ENA. We call it the ENA WebKit. You can Google it and find it, or go to our website, the website for my group.
Yeah.
And so it's got a nice graphic user interface. Doesn't have quite as many options. It isn't quite as powerful as the R implementation, but it makes it extremely accessible for people who are working with their data. If you actually have coded data that's organized in terms of like a CSV file, you can actually just upload it and try and start making the models really quickly. There's a
Does that mean that means that you can't connect back to the actual coded segments? Is that correct?
No. So if your data file has the metadata and the actual original data and the codes, you can go back just as I showed in the example.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I'm hogging the questions here. If anyone wants to add anything in the chat, you're very welcome. I do have one, David, and I hope that you won't feel mad at me for asking it. What are the elements of this approach that, in your view, align it with an ethnographic approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the short answer is that my original qualitative training was from an ethnographer, and I think about things from an ethnographic perspective. Obviously, ethnography focuses on culture. It's literally the writing down of culture. And so the way in which I formulate culture and discourse and so on comes primarily from an ethnographic perspective. But that having been said, I think that the emphasis here is not so much on ethnography per se, but on the more general properties and approaches of qualitative inquiry, of which ethnography is a subset.
Right? That's helpful. Thank you.
I see somebody asking about video.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, that's a great question, Alexis. Thank you. So the short answer is that you can use this approach with anything you can code, and you can actually code anything. That's a longer discussion, which I'm happy to have if people want to get into that. But so in terms of video data, you have to somehow attach codes to the video. One way that people do that is they transcribe the video in terms of the talk. Maybe they transcribe the video in terms of gestures and other things. But eventually, right, it has to be represented as essentially a code which represents a sequence of events that either do or don't have that code, or have it in some percentage, although I explain why I don't think the percentage is the best way to do it. There are some tools to do that. Actually, video data is not my area of specific expertise. There are some tools that allow you to both transcribe and code video in some relatively sophisticated ways. Similar to Deduce and MaxQDA and these other software, for reasons that I don't really understand. Most tools don't actually export something in the CSV format that the data needs, or Excel format, or it's a data table basically, right? We actually have some scripts that help people make that transition. Yeah, Transana is one of the ones I was thinking of, actually. It was originally developed at UW. So yeah, there are tools that let you do that, but ultimately, right, what a quantitative ethnography needs is there to be data that's thick enough to tell a story. You need to tell a story. That story has to get encoded in codes in the data, and then the quantitative ethnography can look at how to make a model that represents that pattern of codes and test whether or not that pattern persists in the data. So at some point you have to be able to get to the stage of a set of codes, and Transana is one way to do that. There are other video editing tools as well. Is that what you meant by your question, Alexis, or have I answered a question that's orthogonal to the one that you were asking about?
No, that was the question I had. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. I wanted to thank you again, David, for spending your morning, our afternoon with us. Really enjoyed learning about this. And thanks again also for pointing us to additional resources. You're very welcome to share those with us, and we can add them in to the materials that will be associated with the video. Very
Great.
happy to do that. Yes, there will be, Andrich, there will be a video of the presentation available. So David has kindly said that the recording of this will be available, will be okay to be shared. So you'll receive an email shortly when we've uploaded that to our YouTube channel. And on that channel, you'll also see all of the recordings of previously held webinars under the CAQDAS Networking Projects webinar series. So thanks everybody for being here today. Thank you for spending your time with us. I've had a really great time and I hope you have as well, and wishing you a good rest of your day if it's only just beginning, and keep well, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good one. Thank you, David.
Oh, thank you. Is the recording still on?
It is. I am now going to